is on understanding ratios. One thing you need to remember is that fractions are a type of ratio. They compare part to whole by division, remembering that all fractions are division problems. So we would say 3 to 4 is 3 divided by 4. And this is going to be an important concept for us. Not all ratios are fractions, because remember, fractions are part to whole. But you can also have a ratio that is part to part. They're not a fraction, but they are a ratio. We can write or express or show ratios in three different ways. We can write them x to y using the word 2. Instead of the word 2, we can say x to y using the colon, or we can use a fraction bar, x to y, remembering that this is division, but we read all of these the same way, x to y, x to y, x to y. And if we say that x equals 4 and y equals 3, we would say 4 to 3, 4 to 3, or 4 to 3. This is a ratio of 4 to 3. And notice that they can also be improper fractions. This is not a fraction. This is a ratio. And I realize, there's a little bit of confusion. We can treat these ratios as fractions, and fractions are a type of ratio. But we can leave them here in this improper state. That if it was a fraction, we would say this is an improper fraction. We don't want to leave it like this. But as a ratio, it is a proper ratio of 4 to 3. Let's talk a little bit more about types of ratios. So we have a group of figures here. We have circles, we have squares, and we have triangles. And we can say we are going to compare squares to triangles. This part here is very important that we label. We need to label all of our ratios, that we are comparing squares to triangles. So let's count 1, 2, 3, 4 squares, and there is only one triangle. So we have 4 to 1 of squares to triangles. We can write that like this, 4 to 1 or 4 to 1. And notice how squares to triangles, squares goes on top, triangles goes on the bottom. We would never write it 1 to 4 because we're not comparing triangles to squares. We're comparing squares to triangles. However, let's change this up a bit. Let's now compare circles to squares. Most of the time, at least in the next little while, when we write these ratios, even though they can be written three ways, this is probably one of the more common we'll be using, because we'll use this to solve a lot of problems. So circles to square, there are 1, 2, 3 circles, and there are 4 squares, as we've already counted. We can write it like this. Again, we can write it like this, 3 to 4 or 3 to 4. Those are all different ways of writing that ratio. We deal with ratios a lot. This is actually one right here, miles per hour. And we would write that like this, miles per hour. We're going to solve a lot of problems using this type of labeling. Notice I have circles to squares. I have miles to hours. I'm comparing miles, a distance, to hours, a time. Ways of measure, two different measurements that we're comparing. Look over here. This is another one we use a lot. Miles per gallon. Miles per gallon. So we're going to be using these quite a bit, but I wanted to point them out to you now. So let's solve a couple of problems here. Bonita asked members of her class if they watch sports on the weekends. The table shows their answers. Use the table for 1 through 3. So we're going to use this information in this table to write some ratios. All right, so these are the members of her class that watch sports on the weekends. 15 of them said sometimes they watch sports on the weekends. 8 of them said they always watch sports on the weekends. And I would have been in this group. I'm part of the 7 that would never watch sports on the weekends. All right. So what is the ratio of the number of students who always watch sports to the numbers who never watch sports? So what two things are we comparing? We're comparing those who always with those who never. So let's write the labeling, because remember, all of our answers, all of our work must be labeled always to never. Always, 8 of them. Never are 7. So we can write that 8 to 7, 8 to 7, or 8 to 7. 3 different ways to write the same answer. Those who always watch sports on the weekends to those who never watch sports on the weekend. Let's look at problem 2. What is the ratio of the number of students who sometimes watch sports, the number of students to the total number of students surveyed? Here's what I'm going to do. Instead of writing out sometimes and total, I'm going to write S and T. Sometimes to total. It makes my life a little easier, especially when we start getting more complicated with problems and doing proportions and solving for proportions and unknown numbers. We will want to just keep it simple where we label it, just so the label is something clear that we can understand. Sometimes to total. So sometimes 15 and total. Oh, wait a second. There's not a box here for total. That means I have to total it. 15 plus 8 plus 7. Well, 8 and 7, I know 7 and 7 is 14, and one more than 14 is 15. So 8 plus 7 is 15, and 15 plus 15 is 30. So my total, even though they don't give that to me, I have to find that out. My total is 15. So, I'm sorry, my total is 30, because 15 plus 15 is 30. So my ratio here, I'm comparing the sometimes to total, is 15 to 30. Just because they don't give you the number for total doesn't mean you can give up. You have to find out the total. Don't make that mistake. I see many students make that mistake. So write 15 to 30, and we'll write 15 to 30. Once again, you've heard me say this before, we always say it the same way, 15 to 30. What does the ratio 30 to 7 represent? So they've given us a 30 to 7. I'm going to write it like this to make my life a little easier. They've given us a ratio 30 to 7. So we have to use, what numbers do we have that have 7? Well, there are 7 who never watch it. So those who never watch sports on the weekend. And where do we have 30? Right here, total. So the total number of students compared to those who never watch. The total to never. So we compared always to never, sometimes to total, and total to never. 30 to 7 is what that is. So let's look at a problem from the homework. We're going to look at problem number 2 here, where they are asking us to compare cellos to violas. So I will write cellos, and I will write violas. I'm writing them in this order because that's the order they're asking them to compare. They're not asking us to compare violas to cellos. They're asking us to compare cellos to violas. So cellos comes first, violas comes second, just like it is right here. This one's the first one, this one's the second one. So I need to go up here and look and say, where's my cellos? By the way, this is not cello, it's cello. In Italian, and this is an Italian word, the C by itself is pronounced CH. So cello. All right. So how many cellos do I have? I have one cello. And how many violas do I have? I have one viola. So I have a ratio here of 1 to 1. And I need to write this in 3 ways. So I write it like I give my labeling. I write it with the fraction bar. I write it with the colon. And then I write it with the words 1, 2, 1. So I've written it 3 different ways. I've labeled it. I've checked. I have one cello. One cello. I have one viola. So this is what I'm expecting to see on tonight's homework. It's actually fairly simple. If you have questions, give me a call.